this lecture, I'm going to be discussing the methods that researchers use to probe infant language learning. Now, there are two natural behaviors that infants exhibit in their daily life anyway that researchers can co-opt for the purposes of their study, and these are looking and sucking. Now, babies look at the things that they find interesting, and they suck harder and faster when they're interested in something. So researchers use these naturally occurring behaviors of mechanisms of demonstrating interest in order to correlate the things that babies are interested in with the kinds of things that they're experiencing in their environment. Specifically for this class, we're going to talk about how that's correlated with language. So the first procedure that I want to talk about is called high amplitude sucking procedure. In a procedure like this, the researcher will use a pacifier that the infant can suck on that's connected to a transducer. And the transducer is connected to a machine that records how hard and how long the baby sucks, as well as the pattern bursts and pauses of oral activity. Basically, what that means is as the infant will suck slower or faster, softer or harder, the machine will record those patterns so that it can see the relationship between what the baby is being exposed to, either visually or auditorily, as it engages in this sucking behavior. This is a really good way of probing infants that are very young, up to about 3 months. So from birth to 3 months, researchers can use this paradigm to figure out what's going on in their minds. An example of the kind of thing that they might do is they might expose infants to a particular sound, like the sound of a word, dad, 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 multiple times over. And as the infant listens to that sound, at first, because it's a new sound, they might suck very fast and hard. But as they repeat that word over and over again, the baby becomes less interested. They habituate to the sound. And so they stop being interested and they start sucking slower, and they might have longer pauses between sucking. The researcher might then switch to a different word, like mom, 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 and as they repeat that new word, the infant becomes interested anew and starts to suck harder and faster again. So this can illustrate that the baby actually is paying attention to the sounds that it's hearing. You can then test the infant's memory by using the same words that you presented to it yesterday, like the next day. So you might bring the infant back to the laboratory and you say some of the same words, and now that the words are familiar, the baby is actually interested in hearing those same words that it learned yesterday. And so you can measure how long and how hard the baby is sucking when it hears words like mom, mom, or dad, dad, in comparison to other words like Bob or Sue or something like that. Of course, your intuition right now is probably telling you, well, the baby is already hearing words like mom and dad in its environment. And indeed, researchers recognize that. So they might use novel words that the baby hasn't ever heard before. So just to explain this paradigm, I used the examples of mom and dad. But it might actually, like the researchers might actually use words like doctor or nurse or things like that the baby is unlikely to have heard, at least in some kind of repeated way throughout its infancy. And so in that way, you can test for memory. How long does memory for that word last? How familiar does the baby seem with certain words? How many repetitions of a word does it take in order for a baby to recognize that as a unique word that it can remember in the future? And then, if you begin using it in sentences, can they pick out words in the sentences and kind of suck harder and faster as they hear words that they're more familiar with? But that becomes a little bit more sophisticated, and so we have to begin switching babies into a different paradigm, because most infants can't pick out words from a sentence at 3 months of age when they're able to do this paradigm. So when they're a little bit older, between the ages of 6 months and or maybe like probably around 4 months to 24 months, they are often doing this procedure that's called the head-turn preference paradigm. And as the name suggests, it's testing their willingness to shift their head, to turn their head toward particular sounds that are interesting to them. So this is not assessing infants' desire to suck on something, but rather their desire to look at something that they find interesting. So the way this experimental paradigm works is the parent, a mother or a father, will sit with an infant on their lap, and they will wear some noise-canceling headphones so that they can't hear what's going on and accidentally influence their infant to behave according to what the parent knows rather than what the infant knows. Often the observers will also wear sound-canceling headphones on the other side of these one-way mirrors. So of course the baby can't see what's going on the other side of these windows, but the observers can look in and see the infant and the mother, and in order to not accidentally influence the baby in some fashion by what they're doing on the other side, they also will often wear sound-canceling headphones. But we do have a video recorder here that is observing what the infant's doing, and later on, independent researchers will often watch that video and code the infant's behavior by, without sound, looking at how long the infant is staring at different parts of the room. So in a typical head-turn preference experimental paradigm, the procedure begins by flashing a green light up at the front just to get the infant's attention. The infant is interested in the flashing green light. They're captivated by it for a few seconds, and that just gets them to look at a neutral point that doesn't have any vocal stimulus associated with it. Then, during the first phase of the experiment, this is called the habituation stage. During this phase of the experiment, the researchers will present sounds over a loudspeaker on either side of the room. And they'll train the infant during this habituation phase to hear and become familiar with particular sounds. And they will also train the infant to learn that the red light will only flash as long as the infant is staring toward that speaker. Now, the infant is naturally predisposed to want to pay attention, to look toward the speaker on the wall that is that's playing a sound that's interesting to them. But in addition to that, visually looking across to that sound, they will start to look away and just listen with their ears and not pay attention with their eyes if there's not something visually stimulating that they might also want to look at, in addition to that sound they want to listen to. And so in order for the researchers to be able to assess their looking behavior, then what they have to do is train the infant to keep looking at the speaker as long as they want to hear the sound. So what they do is they flash the red light, or sometimes they even do something more elaborate, where they'll have like a puppet pop out of the wall, or like some kind of often it's like a dancing monkey or something like that, some puppet of some type. So it might be a flashing light or some kind of puppet that's going to draw the infant's attention. And as long as the infant is looking in that direction, then that red light will continue to flash, or that puppet will continue to dance. But as soon as the infant looks away, as the infant might do, even if they're interested in listening to the sound will turn off and the puppet will disappear. And the infant then recognizes that if I want to keep hearing this sound, or to keep seeing this light or this puppet, then I need to look in this direction and stare at the thing I'm interested in. So they're learning that if they want to keep seeing this thing, if they want to keep hearing this sound, then they need to keep staring at that thing. But when they get bored, they can look away, and those things will disappear, and the infant learns that during this habituation phase. So they present the red light and the speaker on one side of the room, and then they teach them that the other side does the same thing, and they'll habituate the infant to different kinds of sounds. So they train them on learning words like bike, 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 repeated multiple times, and it might be they might be habituated to many different words during this phase. But the point is to train the infant to learn a particular sound, to become familiar with that sound, and feel like they recognize that that's a word. After the habituation or familiarization phase of the experiment, there's a second part of the experiment that's called the test phase, or the experimental phase, where the researchers are trying to test what the infant learned during the habituation or familiarization phase of the experiment. So in this part of the paradigm, they might probe on what the infant has learned by using the words that they repeated in the first phase in sentences now. So, for instance, if the word was bike, they might say sentences that had the word bike in it, like his bike had big black wheels, or the girl rode her big bike, or her bike could go very fast. And after they say these sentences, they're measuring to see how long the infant stares at the speaker that's saying those kinds of sentences compared to the speaker that is repeating words in sentences that don't include the words they're familiar with. So it might be random other sentences of the same length and of the same kinds of words, but that don't include the word bike. It might include some other word that the infant didn't learn in this experimental paradigm. Now, this experiment, this kind of condition here, can be used to probe all different kinds of things. You might test to see whether the infant likes to hear male voices or female voices, whether they prefer to hear sounds from their own language or an unknown language, or whether the infant can discriminate between words that they have learned versus words that they haven't learned. Indeed, in every one of these conditions, you have to have a comparison, because what you're doing is you're seeing, does the infant look a longer period at the speaker that's familiar or that's of one type, or do they look longer at the other speaker? Now here, you're not looking for longer times necessarily. It could be shorter times too, because the infant's preferences will depend on how old they are or how many times they've heard that familiar word before. But really what you're looking for is just differences. It doesn't have to be longer looking at the familiar word or shorter looking at the familiar word. It could be either longer or shorter. It doesn't matter. All you're looking for is it different? Because if it's different, then that means the infant learned that word is a specific unit and can hear it in the sentences that are being read. So, as they listen to sentences that include the word bike, if they stare at those sentences either longer or shorter, it doesn't matter. If they're staring at those sentences for a different amount of time than they're staring at sentences that include words they don't know, that means that they're either interested in or bored by that word, but it means they're treating those sentences different. And that's what we're looking for. Can they recognize that that word in that sentence makes that sentence different than a sentence that doesn't have a word they know in it? Another experimental paradigm that we use to probe infants' understanding of language is called the preferential looking procedure. And this is used to assess understanding of a word's meaning. So in the last experimental paradigm, we learned that you can assess whether infants just recognize that they know a word. But being familiar with a word doesn't mean that you know what that word means. You might hear it in multiple sentences, but that doesn't mean that you know the word bike is an object for transportation with two wheels that roll. Right? You might not know that, but you could still recognize that you're familiar with the word bike. So in this experimental paradigm, we're seeing, does the child know the meaning of the word? And the way we do that is, they have like some speaker or some black box or some experimenter here that will say something like, in this example, it says, find Cookie Monster, and then the two screens will come on, or like some barrier will kind of raise so that the infant can see what's on the other side of the barriers, and the screens will appear, and then the infant will be able to see two images. Here in this example, it's Big Bird and Cookie Monster. And if the child recognizes that Cookie Monster is this character here, then that infant will look longer at that object because they just heard Cookie Monster said over the speaker. A hidden observer will then see they'll measure how long the infant appears to be looking in that direction, and they'll track that to see if they're staring longer at this picture than they are at this picture. This kind of experiment can be used to see if infants have a preference for attractive faces versus ugly faces, or for women versus men, for mom versus dad, but it can also be used, like I'm describing here, to see do they understand the word that's being said. So the researcher here might say, mom, mom, and then they might show on the two screens a picture of the child's mom, or a video of the child's mom, and a picture or a video of the child's dad. And if the infant recognizes that the word mom is referring to mom, then they will stare longer at the video of their mother, and that will indicate to the experimenter that the child knows the word mom refers to the mom. Having learned about the different methods that researchers use, we can now talk about what those methods have led us to know about infant cognition as it relates to language. So there are three primary strategies that are discussed in this section on segmenting speech, which, as you know from your module on Canvas, means being able to pull out or separate out the different chunks of language that are words within a constant stream of speech. If you think about it, when we speak, we have hardly any breaks between the words that we're using. As you can see, if I do that, it's awkward. So infants don't really have very many cues to tell them where the breaks are in what their parents are saying. They have to figure that out on their own. And there are additional strategies beyond these three that we're going to learn about next in our next lecture. But for today, we're just going to focus on these three primary strategies that infants are using to segment the words from a constant stream of speech. So the first one is using familiar words as anchors. What this means is the infants are hearing some words used in isolation some of the time. Not very often, but sometimes parents will say something like the child's name, or mommy's name, or daddy's name, as isolated individual words that aren't used in sentences. They'll just repeat it. They'll just hold the infant and they'll just say that word. Or they'll try to teach the infant the name of mommy. So they'll repeat that word over and over, or they'll point to daddy and repeat that word over and over. And so those become familiar words, the names of common things in their environment or of people that they're familiar with. And if you hear those familiar words in a sentence, that means you kind of can pull them out of the sentence. And what that allows you to do with the sounds next to it is recognize that the sound right after that word you're familiar with, like mommy, must also be a separate unit of its own too. And the sound right before mommy must also be a separate sound. So those, you can kind of pull out that the sounds right before and right after mommy are also unique words. They're unique units. Another thing the infants will do is they try to learn the legal sounds in their language. So across languages, you'll hear that certain sounds are allowed at the beginning of words, and those sounds differ across languages. Like, for instance, in English, we are allowed to start our words with, SP for Spain or Spanish. But ironically, those same sounds are not allowed to start a word in Spanish, and so when Spanish speakers, native Spanish speakers who are learning English, try to say in English the word Spanish, they will often put an E before the word Spanish, so they'll say Espanish. That indicates that the beginning of a word cannot be SP in that language. But there are lots of words that appear in other languages that are legal starts of words that aren't legal starts of words in English. Like the letter combination PT is not a legal combination at the start of a word in English. You can't say like patang, but you can start a word with that sound combination in other languages without a problem. Those are legal or allowed sounds. So infants will kind of hear in the string of speech what kinds of sounds they're likely to hear, what appears regularly, and they'll pick up on those kinds of things that seem like they're allowed in their language, and that will allow them to say, like, that sound combination is likely to be the beginning of a word because it's like the kind of beginning of words that are legal or allowed in my language. Or they might hear those sounds in combination that would be illegal at the beginning of a word and recognize, oh, that must be in the middle of a word. And we'll talk tomorrow about how it is they're able to learn those legal sounds. But for today, just trust that infants are able to figure this out for themselves. And finally, they can use stress patterns. And by stress, I don't mean like difficulty in their environment where their adrenaline is pumping. I mean the emphasis in language. So if you stress certain syllables or emphasize those syllables, then it becomes easier for the infant to pick out what the beginning of the word is. So there's two kinds of stress patterns you'll read in your text called trochaic and iambic stress patterns, and these just refer to whether the emphasis is on the first syllable or on the second syllable. Interestingly, in English, a trochaic stress pattern is far more common. It outnumbers iambic stress patterns 9-1. And that means that if an infant is trying to make guesses about where the words lie, it can use the stress patterns within the words to guess that it's very likely if I'm hearing a syllable emphasized, that's the beginning of a word. Because words, let me give you a couple of examples, like blackmail or canvas or desk. Those are examples of words where the emphasis starts at the beginning of the word, or if it's only a single syllable like desk, then the emphasis occurs on the whole word, and so you can recognize that the emphasis being there means that that's like the beginning or the entirety of a word. But every once in a while, there are words that have an iambic stress pattern, like return or computer, where the emphasis is on the second or the third syllable. And when these words happen, it kind of confuses infants because they're used to the emphasis. At least when they're learning English, they're used to the emphasis being on the first syllable. And so they believe that if they're trying to pull out a word from a sentence and they don't know where those words are or what the words mean, then they'll just kind of rely on the stress patterns being, they'll trust that it's usually at the beginning of a word. So those are the three strategies that you're going to read about as you go through your text today, and just kind of notice the details of how those different strategies work and how it allows the infants to segment their speech when they're trying to figure out where the word breaks are in a sentence.